This is Alex Bryant, President Founder of East West Associates. Thank you all for joining the webinar we're going to conduct tonight on combating the impact of U.S.-China trade tariffs, the growing importance of ASEAN, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and Mexico. Just a couple housekeeping points. We are going to keep this exactly to 1 hour. We are going to ask you all to ask questions as we're going through this process. You can see you've got a question mark. So please click that and then be able to ask any questions. It'll come to me as a moderator. I'll see those questions and then be able to ask the speakers. If you have any questions during this time, please ask them. Rather than having to wait to the end, we much more like an interactive presentation. We're going to move through this. East West briefly is a firm based in Asia and the U.S., and all the team we have all lived and had their careers in Asia, China, Asia Pacific, and Mexico and Eastern Europe, and had P&L responsibilities. So with that ado, we're going to turn to I'm going to turn to the two speakers, Dan McLeod and Mark Plum, and ask them to give a brief background on themselves, and then we can turn to the presentation. So Dan, if you would give a brief background on yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. My background primarily from a manufacturing, engineering, supply chain background. Past 20 or 21 years in Asia, more than half of that in China, but was based in Singapore for 7 years and covered all of Southeast Asia and East Asia out of that position, doing a variety of operations management and managing capital investments for the chemical industry, and also some experience in food processing and electrical components. Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I come at it from kind of the general business, general management background. Like Dan, I've spent the majority of my working career in Asia, starting out in Thailand in the early 90s, moving up to China in the mid 90s, and staying up there steady through 2014/2015. Mostly general management roles, sales, marketing, distribution. My last 12 years, I was president of Briggs & Stratton Asia. We had multiple manufacturing facilities, multiple design labs, test labs, engineering centers, a couple thousand people, and a very, very strong, profitable business. So pretty much an Asia guy my whole life.
Great, thank you, Mark. So at that point, we're going to move forward and look at today's agenda. We're going to focus on really three things. We're going to focus on number one, a foundation of the survey and how companies' perspective and what they're doing to limit the impact of the U.S.-China trade tariffs, how they're limiting that and how they're mitigating the risks that are caused by the U.S.-China trade tariffs. We've done that through a survey we did in August 2018 and another one in August 2019. That will kind of define how companies are looking at this. And then we're going to get into two working case examples of companies in Minnesota and Michigan. So first, what are companies saying about the impact of the U.S.-China trade tariffs? We're going to click over. First is on the overall impact. We took a survey in 2018. As you can see, we were 5 months into the tariffs at that point. And now 2019, August 2019, we're 17 months into it. You can see that there's been pretty significant change. In early 2018, the tariffs were going to have a negative impact on the business. The tariffs were going to affect the raw materials. That's all increased over the last 12 months. Companies are clearly having a negative impact on businesses, and it's both on the raw materials and the component side and on the manufacturing side. So in the last from 5 months when it was taken to now 17 months after the survey was taken, you can see companies have ratcheted up their own acknowledgement of the tariffs and the effect it's having. More importantly, we're looking at the disruption impacts of what's going on in the U.S.-China trade tariffs. We're seeing, for example, that in 2018, 65% thought it was going to be just on supply chain, 13% thought it would be affecting manufacturing. Those numbers have obviously switched. You're seeing now companies, 41% realize it's on both their supply chain and on their manufacturing, and it's disrupting the company as a whole after now 17 months into it. So we took that information and we started saying, looking at companies, what were companies doing at the time? In 2018, 5 months into it, companies were 48%, about half had already started taking efforts to offset the impact of the U.S.-China trade tariffs. Another 27% were looking to figure out how they were going to offset. Now in 2019, we have about 70%, about 7 in every 10 companies has already taken efforts to mitigate these tariffs. And another 43% are currently in the process of taking counteractive measures. And the companies we interviewed for this, there were 200 companies in 2018, and a little over 200 companies, a little over 230 companies in 2019. And all these companies had one criteria, which is they all had 1 to 2 factories on the ground, or they were sourcing and procuring from China and bringing back to the U.S. So out of what this slide to me is probably the most interesting one, in 2018, we're seeing that 5 months into it, in August 2018, 5 months into the tariffs, companies were taking really internal efforts, right? They were having their suppliers eat some of the difference. They were having the customers eat some of the tariffs. They were eating themselves. Internally, they were cutting costs to mitigate this, shifting production, trying to get prepayments. Now, 17 months into it from August 2019, 17 months after the tariffs were initiated, now you're looking at some significant actions. These are not small internal efforts companies are taking. They are really looking at much more strategic changes to their business. And it really focuses on they're trying to optimize their supply chain globally, so their manufacturing footprint and their customer base. And these are strategic actions because I think for our companies, they have realized that the tariffs have caused an inflection point. Many of them are too heavily weighted in China. They realize that now. And whether the tariffs go away today or whether they go away a year or they don't go away, they realize they've got to diversify their own raw material and their manufacturing and their customer base out of fear, recognition that the tariffs can come and go with this administration or the next administration. And they've got it. A lot of companies have gotten quite comfortable in China. They've been there 5, 10, 15, some 20 years. And they realize now they've got to make some changes and diversify. So this slide to me was quite telling. And this final slide was quite telling as well. 2018, you had companies, about 57% thought that the tariffs would drive companies to move beyond China. Well, that's obviously increased about 30%. Now 86% believe that. Almost 9 in 10 companies believe the trade tariffs will drive companies to move beyond China. 41% thought it would relocate manufacturing outside of China. That's now 70%. That's increased another 30%. The tariffs, third one was 84% thought it would drive companies to establish supply chains outside China. 63% are doing that now. What we're finding is 63% of the companies who are establishing plants out, establishing supply chain out of China, and those are the companies that are selling outside China. The remaining 37% of those companies in China for China, and they're manufacturing, they're sourcing raw materials in China and reselling in China. The tariffs there are not having an effect on them. And finally, the last, in 2018, 1% of the companies, one out of 100 thought that it would drive companies to expand their customer base outside China. That's now up to 16%. A lot of people are looking at other parts of the world. So at that point, the key learnings for us coming out of this were, quite frankly, you had, number one, there was a focus on cost increases. It's an important issue, but it's no longer the core point. The main thing is the companies are making some changes, not just supply chain oriented, but much more of a comprehensive approach, looking at their supply chain, global manufacturing, global customer base, and how that's being affected by the tariffs and what steps they're going to take in ASEAN, in Mexico, in Eastern Europe to affect and mitigate those changes and mitigate the tariffs. Companies are certainly less optimistic about a timely end, and they are viewing relocating their sourcing and manufacturing from China as a viable way of mitigating the impact of the tariffs. So at that point, we're going to turn over, we're going to explain briefly this and then get into actual discussion around Asia, around Mexico and Eastern Europe, and then get into 2 case studies. So Mark, I will turn this over to you, if I could.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, this has been a big change. What's happened, and for all you fellows that are people that are in the business managing, it's the uncertainty is really what's causing a lot of heartburn. It's not, the tariffs are the tariffs, but are they on? Are they off? Then you combine that with rising labor rates, combine that with China 2025, and it just paints a picture that unsettling for global manufacturers to either be manufacturing or sourcing in China, particularly if they're not selling or selling in China. So three things they're looking at, of course, is how should they optimize their manufacturing footprint? Do they need a China plus one strategy, an alternative to China that maybe is not maybe leaving China, but maybe supporting China with component supply? That's where, and then maybe a global supply chain optimization, as I just said, a China plus one, maybe moving some suppliers from China down to Southeast Asia, ASEAN, and of course, China now with 2025 and Xi Jinping, a lot of nationalism, a lot of buy China, a lot of things that are causing some concern. I just saw in the morning paper in the Wall Street the Singles Day, which is, as everyone knows, is the online like Black Friday, and a lot of emphasis on buying China, buying Chinese. So things have changed. Now people are realizing they're going to have to make some moves. It's not going to fix itself, and they're being very, very proactive. Next slide, Alex, please.
Sure.
So we, again, here at East West, we again, and if you heard Dan and I and Alex talk, we've been long-term Asian China guys a long time, so we know China really well, and we like China. It's just that now we're saying that there's three other regions you may want to be looking at, depending on where your end products are going to be ending up. In ASEAN, for example, of course, is great. It's 800 million people. It's a young population. It's a GDP 3, 4, 5%, and moving manufacturing down there is a great supplier base and also a great consumption, a great place to of course sell products. If maybe you're supplying Europe from China, then we've got some experience and some projects going on in the Visegrad area now, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Czech Republic. Tremendous opportunities there for manufacturers to produce for consumption there, but maybe more importantly, shipping into Germany, Italy, England, the Netherlands, 4 or 5 hour drive from Poland, some of the major cities to Berlin. So really pretty convenient. And then also, if you're in China and you're exporting back to the States, a large portion of your business, then Mexico has great opportunities. Mexico was China kind of before China, and then when in the late 80s, when the labor rates were 40% cheaper in China, so much stuff got sucked out of Mexico, got sucked out of ASEAN for that matter as well, went to China. Well, now those things have changed, so a good place to sell, but probably a better place to position yourself to sell back into the USA, which is in many cases probably your biggest market. Next slide, please.
Mark, we already had a question pop up. The question was, can you talk a little bit about these different regions regarding labor rates, skill sets? So just breaking that down, on the ASEAN side, first of all, you talk a little bit around the skill set and the labor rates in ASEAN, around the member companies.
Sure, be glad to. So again, and we know 5 or 6 countries in addition to China really pretty well. So if China, if a unit of labor now, if you use $1 as an hourly rate, Thailand would be, for example, 50 cents an hour, and Vietnam on the lower end would be at 25 cents an hour. Thailand's labor efficiency would be on par with China, so a very good comparison. Where Thailand being half as expensive as China, and then Vietnam would not be a quarter as much because your labor is not as efficient. So you have to kind of factor that in. Now, people would say, well, you can go to West China, go out to Ulaanbaatar perhaps, and that kind of stuff. But then you're biting off a lot of other issues. These areas like Vietnam and Thailand and the Philippines, very sophisticated manufacturing. Again, having lived in Thailand in the early 90s, having opened up our rep offices in Vietnam in the early 90s after the embargo was lifted, The auto companies have been in Thailand. The HVAC companies and the appliance companies, all global brands, have been manufacturing in Thailand, south in the Rayong Chonburi area for 30, 40 years. Frankly, before they were in China. In the labor rates in Visegrad, we use Poland because we have a lot of good experience there and some projects going on. Poland's labor rates would be on par, maybe a little bit above China. But however, if you then factor in the fact that you're only 4 hours away, 5 hours away from your major markets, you can truck your products in. That labor rate being a little bit higher becomes, really non-material. Where early on that labor rate in China was 40% less than Poland 20 years ago. So, again, if your market is Europe, then the Visegrad countries look really well. And then Mexico, again, kind of the same thing as Europe. If your market is USA, Mexico now would be on par with China, more expensive than Vietnam, of course. However, again, if your market is USA, you're in with the new free trade agreements. You could be 4 or 5 hours away from some of your largest markets. So it really depends on what your strategy is and where your end markets are and where you want to send the products to, be it labor or be it manufacturing expertise.
Excellent, Mark, and I think we we know from recent experience of what we're doing. We're seeing. You mentioned Poland, the other three countries there: Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary. Hungary's can be in line certainly with Poland. Czech Republic, particularly around Prague areas, can be in line. Slovakia, you're going to have some reduction, particularly in Western Slovakia.
That's correct.
And we're seeing in Mexico, we're seeing is a little comparable to what's going on in Visegrad 4. And final question popped up around Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Was talk a little bit about the manufacturing skill sets in those areas for those three particular markets, ASEAN.
Yes, sure. Good question. So Thailand, as I was saying, they've great universities. Chulalongkorn, of course, and Thammasat produce really good engineering students. I've hired hundreds of them over the years, and then they have great technical schools and trade schools down in the Rayong Chonburi area. And as I said, they've been producing global appliances, global autos, and global HVAC for 40 years. Malaysia would be the same way, particularly up north in the Penang area. Great electronics. All the Japanese electronics guys have been in there for 30 or 40 years. So tremendous manufacturing skills. I would say Vietnam is not there yet because they're probably 20 years behind, but a lot of investment going in there. Companies are going in there. Attractive labor rates. So you may have to put maybe a few more of your own management people in there, maybe even some expats to kind of keep track of things early on. But again, big opportunities.
Okay, all right, and we are seeing as far as Dan, you agree with that? You lived a long time in Malaysia and Indonesia in that area. Anything you would add on Malaysia, Indonesia, and those countries?
I think Mark covered it. Malaysia, particularly, you've got higher tech manufacturing around like electronics industry. Also for electrical, you consider the Philippines, but in general, there's different pockets of excellence around the region. So generally, you can find pretty much anything you want within the region.
Great. All right. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, sure. So next slide. So and these three things we look at is cross-border trade. We look at diversification, and we look at strong manufacturing growth for all three regions. So I'm gonna have to show you three charts coming up. This one is cross-border trade, but it's also affects Mexico and Visegrad. So what this really says is if you go to ASEAN, you got 800 million people, and there's a tremendous amount of exports going out of ASEAN to United States, to Hong Kong, to Japan, and of course certainly back to China. And if you look at ASEAN as far as imports, again, a tremendous amount of volume of business coming back in, be it from China, be it from Japan, that sort of thing. Yeah, again, you can make the same argument for Visegrad, and you can make the same argument for Mexico. But the next slide will focus a little bit on diversification, and we'll use.
Mark, I just had a question come in from a manufacturer, Illinois-based manufacturer, says, do you have a high level of concern of transshipping activities in ASEAN?
Well, yeah, I mean, people would say right now, you see the numbers on Vietnam spiking as far as exports to the USA, a big spike. Well, that's not necessarily all exports coming from Vietnam back to the United States. That's some transshipping, going from China to Vietnam to the United States to avoid some tariffs. But I don't know if that's material or not. I mean, if you're in Asia, in your ASEAN, and you're producing there, and you have free flow of goods, you've got a China market of 1.3 billion, and you've got an 800 million ASEAN market. So you got 2 billion, people in that area, and where you can move people and you can move the flow of goods. So, I'm not so sure transshipping is a real concern.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So and then diversified. Yeah, we just want to kind of show you that you got again Visegrad, Hungary, great. Automobile guys have been there for years. Audi around the Budapest, probably around Hungary area, is likes that a lot, of course. Slovakia, again, appliances, automobiles, Volkswagen's really strong down there. Czech Republic, particularly along the Polish border, the Silesian-Moravian region, a lot of great manufacturing, air conditioning, appliances, auto components. And then in Poland, the south is heavy manufacturing, autos, working in the Silesian region. In the middle, a city called Łódź, great. It's one of the white good capitals of Europe. All the big guys are there producing white goods, shipping them back into Germany and Western Europe. So great manufacturers producing across a variety of products.
And Mark, this same diversification of manufacturing exists not only in Eastern Europe, but also in ASEAN and also within Mexico.
Of course. As I said, in Mexico, those of you who have been doing business down there, the auto guys are down there. The appliance guys are down there. Monterrey is kind of the center for white good manufacturing with Mabi and Whirlpool and GE. The water heater guys and the air conditioning guys are all along the Maguilas and Juarez, in those areas. Saltillo is a great area for large truck manufacturing. Mercedes has got some big operations down there. So, yeah, great areas. These places really are. And then, of course, the last slide here just shows that, and this is for all three. We use Mexico here because as an example, but continued manufacturing growth since 2009. Well, that's about the time 2009, 2010, 2011, China began to slow down a little bit, because WTO was 2001. People were going in there in the mid 90s. So after 10 or 15 years, wages started to go up a little bit, and that's the issue with China, is that top down every year mandated by the government, and it makes unless you're there to sell there because that's where your market is, it can make it very difficult. So yeah, that kind of gives the three regions and talks about cross-border trade, talks about diversification of manufacturing, and also talks about growth in manufacturing. So we'll talk about, on our next slide, we'll step into a case study. So yeah, this is and then we'll have three case studies. I'll do the one here on ASEAN, and then Dan has one on, of course, Mexico and Visegrad. And so yeah, this is I think a very interesting one and quite timely. Next slide, please. So a client of ours, I've known him for years, a Michigan-based automotive lighting manufacturer, facilities USA, China, and Europe. The Chinese facility, they actually had come through an acquisition of a major European business that they purchased. They've been growing 12 to 15% a year for the last 5 years. And now all their factories, the USA, in Michigan, Western Europe, and China were at full capacity. the business was really successful. So now they had to decide where they wanted to add capacity. And the idea was, well, the biggest upside was Asia Pacific, China. So let's just add capacity in China. They needed to add significant capacity, going up to roughly a 200,000 to 300,000 square foot facility, a production plan of about 200 to 250 employees. So a rather significant increase. They originally had asked us to do a site study for them because they were in Fujian, and all they really knew in Asia was China. Smart people, good management, all pretty much in their mid to late 40s, and they'd been on the China wagon, for all that time, and they really didn't have a good understanding of Asia before China. So we did a study for them, and we said, why don't we sit down and let's do an analysis on your whole business. So next slide, please.
Sure.
So we at East West, we have a kind of a 4-step process, and I mean it's really, first of all, it's really sitting down with our clients and really understanding their business. They had originally just wanted to go to expand in China because they thought, well, it's China, and we kind of know our way around there a little bit. And what else would we do? Well, we said, well, let's kind of look at. So we mapped out their business, mapped out where they were selling in. Quite frankly, only 15% of the business was staying in China, and the balance was all going to ASEAN and plus Australia, right? So, and the sales growths were strong in China, but even stronger in ASEAN. Of course, price is in any business is a pretty big deal, and they were getting some Chinese competition, so they had to kind of get their costs down if they could, and they wanted to be nearer their markets. As ASEAN was growing because of labor, intensive product or large size products for shipping. So we helped them develop a criteria of what they wanted to look for as if they relocated or when they relocated. So labor supply and labor costs were probably number one. We had to have availability of good labor, both white collar and blue collar management and engineering. We had to have government incentives because we thought, hey, we're number in this company. What they did, they had the best known brand in the world, and they had the largest market share in the world of their products. We wanted to watch inflation rates because we were getting a little tired of China. Every year, the 8-10% top down increases on labor driven by the government. Of course, we had to have raw materials. We had to have good import in and out, and we had to have good vendors. Vendor availability. So we proposed a 6-country study: Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and of course China. We weighted all. We had a matrix put together, again, government incentives, labor costs, inflations, raw materials, et cetera. Our recommendation was Thailand, and for a variety of reasons, we'll talk about that, and they agreed.
Mark, question came up on when you're talking about, obviously it's an automotive lighting company, and it talks about availability. One of the areas you weighted was raw materials. So the question was, within the countries you looked at, which one have had available industrial lighting? How did you figure out which countries had it, which ones did actually have it?
Well, yeah, we work, of course, with the first place we usually go is the local country's board of investments and their investment boards, and to see and work with them to see who is part of their group in those countries already, and they're a wealth of knowledge because they typically, if companies are there already, that they might have been brought there, or they might be on some incentives from the government. So we usually go to the board of investment of the local, with Thai board of investment, Vietnam Invest, Philippine Invest, and then of course you can go down the different chambers, be it the British Chamber, the American Chamber, the Japanese Chamber. So you can get a handle around that fairly quickly.
And obviously, since East West, we've got people on the ground there. Obviously, for us, we already knew it.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, and for the sake of, let's just take the auto lighting out. So the biggest auto market, of course, in the world is China. Now, it wasn't always that way. Remember, they went from 1 million to 20 million automobiles in about 25 years. When I first went there to China in 1994, they were making 1 million automobiles a year. So, there's other big markets. Japan is a kind of a closed auto society. You got to be there to play there. Korea is the same way. But after that, Thailand has been making close to 3 million automobiles for a long time and exporting them. So we knew that. So we knew there was strong component suppliers in Thailand, because we knew the auto industry was really strong in Thailand based on being on the ground there for a long time. So
Right.
if it would have been electronics, like Dan said, Malaysia, particularly the Penang area, very strong. Also for electronics, as kind of Dan mentioned earlier, is the Philippines. That kind of stuff, motorcycles, things of that nature. So, if you live out there and work there for a lifetime, you know industries, you know people, because somehow you've been involved in a bunch of it for a long time.
That's great. Thanks so much.
Sure. Okay, our next slide, our client said, okay, that's nice, you like Thailand, but now we've got to build a cost model on this thing to go to the board, and you got to help us do that. So, okay, then now we're on the ground in Thailand. Our team's on the ground in Thailand. We're visiting potential sites. We're getting costs of land. We're understanding availability of land. We're understanding improved land versus unimproved land. We're understanding leasing it versus buying it. We're working closely with the Thailand Board of Investment, Secretary General, who we know for many years, and understanding what they're looking for. And as you guys know this, a country, if they're going to give you tax incentives, they want something for it. So you need to find out, what do they want? In the case of Thailand, in the metal manufacturing industry, they wanted technology, they wanted R&D centers, they wanted test labs, they wanted you to be doing some primary design after 5 years. So you have to understand that, so you can design your offering when the time comes. Then we had to understand about, we got to build a building, so we had to find architects and engineering firms. Then we had to have someone they would design the building. Then we had to find general contractors that would build the building. Then we had to do our people, our team on the ground, to management as the owner's representative, to make sure the contractors and the architects were working on behalf of our client, not on behalf of themselves. And then, of course, you have to find third-party providers for, staffing, for finance, for legal, for all those things, and also to help you with establishing your entities and getting all that kind of stuff. So based on that, we were able to go to them and give them an estimate of what it would cost to put this project together and be successful with it. And we gave them an estimate of between $50 and $55 million, and we quantified that. Of course, they went to the board and got it approved. So then the next step was, all right, guys, well, we don't have a lot of guys that know how to do this. We build lights. We don't build factories. So we were then hired and challenged to go ahead and buy all the land, get the permits, finalize the designs, get the contractors, the engineers, turn the shovels, put the pilings in. So we had all that finalized in November of 2018. In July 2019, we began to install the equipment. In September, 3 months ago, we cut the ribbon for a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility, and then it was all quite successful. So to finalize, what were the results? Well, government incentives. As I said, when we were negotiating with the Thailand Board of Investment, it's not really negotiation, it's really finding out what they want and then seeing if you can fit that into what you want to do. Originally, our client wasn't thinking about putting a big R&D center there, wasn't thinking about putting test labs in, and wasn't thinking about doing a lot of primary research. When they decided, hey, that might make some sense, we were able to negotiate that 9-year tax holiday, CIT, corporate income tax holiday, no tax for 9 years, and 40% tax for additional 5 more years. So what did that drive? Well, these are all the numbers from our client, of course, as compared to their original pro formas, had they stayed in China where they originally planned, they saved $19 million. They will save $19 million based on their pro formas in China over 10 years. Their labor savings, because again, labor is about half in Thailand as it is in China, 6.3 million. Because they're down there in really the hub, the tight area of Rayong, Chonburi, where all the auto guys are, we found additional savings in raw materials. And the fact that we were down there further south in our markets, our freight costs were down. And the last thing is when they looked at their numbers over, based on their original plan, they increased their sales forecast for 5 years 39%, and based on the fact that they had lower costs now, they could pass some of that on to their clients, and they had a 58% increase in revenues over 5 years based on the same savings. So, all in all, it was a very successful project.
Excellent, Mark. And before we leave, as we're leaving ASEAN, we did have one additional question. Someone popped up, one of the companies here, and said, which ASEAN company is most vertically integrated? Are they buying China-made components and applying enough conversion costs? Or is there a country most suited to local sourcing? I guess it really depends on what product you're talking about.
Well, that's right. But, again, Thailand and Malaysia, I say this, I don't want to sound repetitive. They were China before China was China. Our client is vertically integrated in Thailand. They're not bringing components down from China. In fact, early on, my first years in China, I was bringing components from Thailand to China. So no, Vietnam would be different, of course. You would, if you have a manufacturing base in China today, and you want to go to Vietnam, you'd have to bring some of this stuff in early on from China to Vietnam until you established a stronger vertical integrated component supply. But
Sure.
Malaysia, Thailand, I think I could safe to say Philippines, no, good local suppliers.
Great. All right. Now we turn over to Dan. Dan's going to talk about Vice Guard 4 Eastern Europe and on Mexico. So, Mr. Dan, I'll turn over to you now.
Okay, thanks, Alex. This second case study is around a Minnesota-based manufacturer, also in the automotive space. And this company had operations in the U.S. and China, originally all located in the U.S., but in the early 2000s started to move manufacturing into China to take advantage of lower costs, lower labor costs, and general overhead costs. And initially, they achieved very significant savings to the point that they eventually relocated half of their production there. Their business continued to grow, and an area a geographic region that grew faster than the others was Europe. And so Europe eventually grew to be nearly half of their sales, which was being supplied out of the U.S. and China. So that created several problems. One, logistics costs were quite high, regardless of whether you're coming from the U.S. or China. But the cost advantage of China, as everyone's aware of, over the years had eroded, not just with labor rates and energy costs, but also the currency changes. The strengthening of the renminbi further drove up costs and reduced the margins. And then with that long supply chain into Europe, their inventories were excessive. They were holding up to 5 months of finished product inventory because of that long lead times required. And then also responsiveness with the long lead times, long supply chains, responsiveness to customer needs in Europe was very slow. And you had to a smaller extent, but a similar problem in the U.S. because they're also bringing product from China into the U.S. So that long supply chain, logistics costs, and the increasing operating costs in China was really causing fits. Like the previous example, the company was faced with at somewhat of a crossroads because they had to invest in capacity. They were approaching the capacity of their U.S. and Chinese operations. So they had to decide where to invest. So they did a cost analysis, and it looked like Europe was a significant opportunity, and also wanted to explore sourcing options in Mexico rather than China. Again, Chinese costs had escalated, and Mexico looked like a good opportunity for them as well. So East West was brought in for two pieces, two work tracks here. One, to develop a European manufacturing supply chain footprint. So again, this was to look at country analysis, select site for factory, tax incentives, take it through construction and startup, and then to develop a Mexican strategy and supply chain footprint. That could be manufacturing, it could be a sourcing play. We weren't sure when going in, and that sort of became evident as we got into the analysis, which direction we wanted to move there.
So
Next
then,
slide, please.
that manufacturing piece is more around that involved the manufacturing, setting up a new site, negotiating the land, and the Mexican focus was pretty much more heavily on supply chain and subcontracting. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
All right.
That's correct.
So in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, so the European piece, again, we wanted to first understand the business and develop an approach of entering Europe with their manufacturing. And we developed a phased approach for their investment that would front load the savings. We looked at which products to move and when, and an approach to investment and expansion that would try to drive as much of the savings as possible in the front of the project to improve the returns, and with that develop the requirements for the property that they would need. Then went to look at where do we locate, and we developed a scorecard working with the client's priorities. They were very concerned about getting adequate technical labor and professional staff, the supply and the cost of that. So that was a key criteria. They needed to be connected logistically throughout Europe. Their customers were all through the continent, and they wanted to be able to access fairly reasonably. Wanted an established supplier base in the automotive industry. Wanted to be close to suppliers, both suppliers, and that also helps with the technical staff, finding people with the skill sets from other employers in the region. Very interested in incentives. In Central Europe and Visegrad, there are still very attractive incentives, and there's a range of them. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. But so they were looking for good incentives, ease of doing business, transparency. The local support of the government really wanted to make sure that where they went, they would be welcome as a manufacturer in the automotive space. There are certain parts of the region that is good manufacturing base around the region. Some regions are more fit for certain industries than others. Some governments are more supportive, regional governments, of some industries than others. So we want to get a good fit there. And then the speed of the project execution. So East West has got people on the ground in Europe, knew the area, had done work in the area over the years and setting up factories and businesses. So we had that staff to rely on, plus desktop research. And then in the case of, similar to what Mark talked about in ASEAN, deal a lot with government agencies, board of investment agencies that facilitate and bring in foreign investment. Great source of information, great resource. Property developers, very mature and sophisticated market in Central Europe with international property developers that are either buying land and developing it on spec or doing it to your build-to-suit needs. HR services providers were a great source of information regarding not just labor rates, but general availability and things that are on the ground insight into the labor situation in the region. And when we went through this process scorecard, we came up with Hungary for this location. Strong automobile industry drove it, good staff, good logistics.
Hey, Dan, one
Um,
question popped up before you go into step three. Why not just build the plant in Germany if that's where their major market was? Germany and Western Europe, France. Why not just put it in there rather than go to Visegrad for, at least in this case, go to Hungary?
okay. There's a couple of reasons. One would be labor and professional staff costs, which are roughly half in Central Europe versus Western Europe, and that's a significant consideration. But another consideration that might not be so obvious or well known is that construction costs in Central Europe are much less than Western Europe. Tends to be numbers published in the neighborhood of 20 to 25% cheaper to build in Central Europe. So, and then of course the incentive structure was much more favorable in Central Europe. So that's what drove that. It far overweighed the logistics aspect. Then when we decided generally where we were going to go, we had to find a particular site to develop. We evaluated 8 potential sites and shortlisted 4 sites for further negotiation, looked at evaluate lease versus purchasing options, and then when negotiated conditions for property purchase or management. Went in and met with local government agencies and legal and accounting firms on the ground to really develop a roadmap, understand all the steps and the process and the timetable for establishing the business entity. That can be a bit convoluted and difficult when you're new in an area. So enlisted the help from local folks with that. Negotiated incentives with the regional government. In Central Europe, there's a variety of incentives. They can be training subsidies, for one. They can be research and development subsidies, cash subsidies. The most common one, though, is, and generally the largest impact, is you're allowed to take a credit for your investment over several years of corporate income tax. So you can reduce your corporate income tax payments by a percentage of your capital outlay at the beginning of the project, and so that was the biggest and the most important one. That interviewed, evaluated engineering design firms, property developers, construction contractors, really qualified the people that we would need to support the execution, and provided analysis, a recommendation that was accepted by the board of directors. So
now
next slide, please.
Sure. So now you've got the sites, and now you're moving to implementation.
That's right. So we provide an owner's representative on the ground to coordinate the selection of the engineering and the contractors. Identified local component suppliers and worked with the client to qualify a new supply chain for the factory. Selected HR partner and assisted with the management selection. I got those folks on board 6 to 9 months prior to startup so that they would be in place and have their systems in place and have their people hired and be ready to go. Oversaw installation and commissioned the new facility, and then once it was up and running, there's a number of operating permits and inspections they were required to finalize the project, and we made sure that happened on time.
So Dan, as we're moving from there into Eastern Europe into Mexico, and this is obviously a different project. This is a sourcing project, some kind of project. How did a question popped up for a company that says, how did you find the technical skill sets and labor in Hungary and or in Hungary?
Well, normally we went through worked with HR recruiting firms and we did this early to understand which parts of the country would have a suitable base, and that'd be a combination of unemployment rates, but more importantly the schools and the industries in the area would generate the people appropriate for this business. And when you compare, if you want to compare the skill sets, folks in Central Europe, stack up very well with other parts of the world. Certainly, good engineers, good technical talents throughout the region.
Super. Thank you.
All right, so moving on to Mexico, the second track we were on. Really wanted to understand what opportunities the client may have for sourcing components out of Mexico. And as we got into it and tried to understand their business and what their current model was, we found that one product line that they were sourcing from China had two major customers in Mexico. So they were supplying it from China to the U.S. and then distributing it all through North America into Mexico. So that looked like a good place to start. And this, there was not a very high manufacturing component in this, or in-house manufacturing. This was primarily component sourced and rather straightforward assembly and packaging for these products. So this appeared to be a good fit to move quickly into Mexico to save logistics costs and reduce inventories and save time. So we continued on the evaluation of which components to source in Mexico and where to assemble the product. So what we found is that we could find 80% of the components we needed with good quality, good capable suppliers from Mexico. So that said that that indicated we had a winning model there, and that the assembly could be done in Mexico to take advantage of lower labor costs and also to minimize logistics. We wanted to start close to those two major customers and take out as much of the movement of product as possible. And we looked at contracting the assembly operation to a third party would be the fastest to implement, and it would minimize investment. So rather than taking the time and the significant capital investment to set up an owned manufacturing facility in Mexico, what made the most sense in this case was a contract manufacturing operation. Alex?
Sure. Dan, if we move forward to the next one, another question popped up, which says, we have concerns about corruption and safety in Mexico. Can you comment? Maybe we have the same concerns. We've been operating there a long time, so we know where it is safer than other places. But Dan, you want to comment on that?
It's an issue, and most companies go out of their way to manage it. It's generally, if you're in the major cities and you take common sense precautions, you're okay. But it's a less comfortable environment than some other parts of the world. Manageable, but a little more challenging.
Certainly, yes.
All right. So
I think it's fair to say, Dan, that certainly goes into our analysis of where if you have to put in a facility there, where you're going to subcontract. That's part of the site selection or evaluation of subcontractors.
It certainly is, because you're going to be moving, even though you've subcontracted the manufacturing. Most times you're going to be having fairly frequent travel between the QA and technical people from the U.S. into Mexico. So you want to make sure that that's accounted for in your selection.
Yeah, and the same for the corruption. Be very careful on that. I think on the corruption side, the person asked about the corruption. When we're doing that, we do a lot of background checks on people when we're doing this in Mexico. Out of fear, to make sure we know who we're working with.
Yes. So third step was really identifying and qualifying suppliers, potential component suppliers through desktop research, and also going to government agencies for their data and statistics, and of course our people on the ground that got many years working throughout Mexico. We developed supplier qualification templates that were completed by the candidates, and shared technical specifications, especially including QC and testing procedures, shortlisted, and then for the finalists had them issued requests for quotes that would provide unit cost and quality control plans, and then we also would build in price breaks for increased volume, and over time, the assumption was they would become more productive and would be able to continue to bring cost down over time. And then samples for life cycle testing. Followed a somewhat similar process for identifying contract manufacturers, where we researched, shortlisted, interviewed. But with a contract manufacturer, we also wanted to look at a few value-added services that are beyond the manufacturing. That would be wanted them to schedule and handle inbound freight from the suppliers. Want to be able to train them up so they could do QA inspection on the incoming materials and arrange for any return to non-conforming. And of course, they do warehousing, assembly, and packaging, and handle the outbound shipments. So, next slide, Alex.
Sure.
And then final negotiation on both suppliers and a contract manufacturer that incorporated the key elements. In addition, negotiated and agreed upon their inventory holding and stocking requirements for us, what sort of lead times and forecasting requirements, and any warranties. And I mentioned earlier from the contract manufacturer the value-add services around QA inspection and returns, and monitoring and expediting deliveries from the suppliers. Minimize the language difficulties from the client. We wanted the contract manufacturer to help us keep tabs of incoming shipments and expedite as necessary. So we recommended and implemented over about a 9-month period in this case. So, next slide, Alex. So good results on both phases of this project. In Hungary, large savings, cost reduction savings. Big one on logistics costs. We've talked a lot about labor savings versus the U.S. Similar labor costs to China, but when we compared to product coming from the U.S., there was substantial labor savings. Raw material savings in Europe versus the U.S. in particular. And I mentioned the tax incentives, tax savings, and that'll amount to approximately $9 million over 10 years. Other benefits include inventory reduction, very substantial cash benefit, and then reduce the risk from currency fluctuation. Less concern about that being in Europe and selling in Europe. In the Mexico side, a cash improvement, reduce the inventory, reduce the cost of approximately 5% versus sourcing the product from the U.S. into Mexico, and with potential for additional reductions. And then, of course, we eliminated tariff impact for that product coming out of China. And other benefits, it was relatively quick to set up and low cost to implement. And, an important part as we're setting up and ramping up, there's very good access to the contract manufacturer for technical and QA staff coming out of the U.S. to start it up, which is more of a challenge if you're doing something in Southeast Asia and Europe if you're trying to support that from the U.S. But Mexico, that's a plus. So pretty good win on both projects.
Yeah, they were pleased with the Mexico side on subcontracting, sourcing, and certainly on the Hungary plant. And as a result of the Hungary, then they were cutting down supply chain production in China, saved them significant money on the logistics costs. All right, well, it is now 10 o'clock. We promise you we'd have you in and out in an hour. It is that time. So first of all, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to ask questions. Thank everyone for participating on this. We appreciate it. And this is now an official end to this webinar from East West Associates. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.